We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every notification.
According to investigators, a search conducted inside a room connected to Tommaso has uncovered evidence that may directly affect the established timeline of events, not by adding something new, but by shifting what was already believed to be understood. And when a timeline changes in a case like this, everything connected to it has to be reviewed again. Because up until this point, the sequence appeared structured, not complete, but stable. There was a window. There were movements. There were signals that aligned closely enough to suggest a pattern investigators could follow. Now that pattern is being questioned. And it begins with a space that had not been fully examined before, Tommaso's room. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to Nancy Guthrie herself, not just as a missing person, but as someone whose life followed consistency. She was 84 years old, living alone in Tucson, Arizona. Her daily routine was predictable in the way routines become after years of repetition. Morning calls, meals at regular times, personal items kept in specific places, not out of habit alone, but out of preference. That level of consistency creates something investigators rely on, a baseline. When that baseline breaks, it stands out. On the night she disappeared, nothing immediately suggested disruption from the outside. There was no forced entry, no visible damage. No indication that someone had entered without being allowed in. That detail shaped the early direction of the case, because if access was not forced, then it was permitted, or at least understood. That's where Tommaso first entered the structure of the investigation, not as a suspect at the time, but as someone connected to the environment, someone who had been present, someone who knew the layout, the routine, the timing. According to his own statement, he was inside the house that night. That admission placed him within the timeline. Investigators began reconstructing that timeline using the tools available to them. Not memory, not assumption, but data. The most critical piece came from Nancy's pacemaker, a device designed for medical monitoring, but one that also records activity, subtle changes, movement, irregular patterns that under normal circumstances would never be part of an investigation. But in this case, they were. According to medical analysis, the device recorded a sudden change that evening. Not gradual, but immediate. A shift consistent with stress or physical distress. Minutes later, additional movement was logged. Not typical movement, not routine, irregular, abrupt. Then escalation, and finally, silence in the transmission. That sequence created a window, a defined period in which something happened inside that house. At the same time, investigators examined the home's security system. Cameras had been installed, standard coverage for entry points, continuous recording, stored footage. But what they found was not a clear record. There were gaps. Not random gaps, but precise ones. Periods where the system had been placed into maintenance mode. According to investigators, this was not a malfunction. It required access. It required knowledge of the system. And, more importantly, it aligned with the same window recorded by the pacemaker. That alignment formed the foundation of the case's timeline. From there, movement data began to fill in the rest. Devices connected to nearby towers, signals appearing, then leaving the area, patterns forming from digital traces. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to establish direction. For a while, that direction held. But this is where things began to change. Because while the main areas of the house had been examined early in the investigation, one area remained less central in the initial stages: Tommaso's personal space, his room. According to investigators, it was not ignored. It was documented, observed, processed like the rest of the property, but it did not immediately present anything that stood out, nothing that contradicted the timeline being built, nothing that required immediate reassessment. Until recently. The exact reason for the renewed focus on that room has not been fully disclosed, but investigators confirmed that a second, more detailed examination was conducted, not broad but targeted, based on new information that has not yet been made public. And during that examination, something was found, not something large, not something obvious, but something that did not fit within the established sequence. According to sources close to the investigation, the item was recovered from within the room itself, not hidden in a way that suggested it was meant to be discovered later, but not placed in plain view either. It existed in a position that suggested it had been overlooked during earlier searches, or possibly not recognized for what it represented at the time. The exact nature of the item has not been officially released, but investigators have confirmed one detail: it carries data. And that detail is what matters, because data does not rely on memory. It does not change under pressure. It exists independently of explanation. And when new data is introduced into an existing timeline, the timeline must adjust to accommodate it. That is what investigators are now doing, reconstructing the sequence again. Because if this newly recovered evidence indicates activity that falls outside the previously defined window, then the structure of the case shifts. It suggests that what happened inside that house may not have been limited to the time frame originally believed. And that raises a difficult question. Was the timeline incomplete? Investigators have not answered that publicly. But the internal response has already begun. Digital records are being reprocessed. Device activity is being compared again. Movement patterns are being overlaid with the new data point. And early indications suggest something significant. A misalignment, small but consistent. A gap between what was recorded and what may have actually occurred. If confirmed, that gap changes the sequence. And when the sequence changes, roles begin to shift. Presence means something different. Timing becomes more important. And statements that once aligned with the timeline may no longer do so in the same way. That's where the focus returns to Tommaso. Because the room where this evidence was found is not a neutral space. It is a controlled environment, personal, limited access, a place where objects do not appear without reason. Which means whatever was found there was placed, used, or left behind. And each of those possibilities carries weight. According to investigators, the next phase of the case is not about expanding outward. It is about narrowing inward. Testing this new piece of evidence against everything that has already been established. The pacemaker data, the security system logs, the movement records, the statements, all of it now has to align again. Or it doesn't, and that is where the case stands right now. Because if this evidence confirms that activity occurred outside the original window, then the timeline investigators relied on was only part of the story. And if it was only part of the story, then something happened either before or after that window that has not yet been fully accounted for. The exact details remain unclear. But what investigators are now considering is this: the timeline may not have been wrong, just incomplete. And if that is true, then the most important question is no longer what happened inside that window. It is what happened outside of it. When investigators revisited the timeline, they did not begin with assumptions. They began with comparison. The newly recovered evidence from Tommaso's room had introduced a variable, not a contradiction on its own, but a point that did not fully align with what had already been established. And in investigations like this, even a small inconsistency requires a full review. So they went back to the beginning again. Not the public version of events, but the internal structure, the sequence built from data. The pacemaker readings were re-examined first. According to medical analysts, the original interpretation had been sound. The distress signal, the movement, the escalation, and the eventual loss of transmission all followed a pattern consistent with a physical event. That had not changed. But what investigators began to question was not the data itself. It was how it had been framed within the timeline. Because the pacemaker did not record everything. It recorded changes in the body. It recorded reactions. But it did not explain cause. It did not show what happened before the first spike or after the final signal. It only captured the portion where the body responded. And that distinction matters. Because if new evidence suggests activity outside that recorded window, then the pacemaker timeline becomes a segment, not the full sequence. That's when things began to shift. Investigators moved to the security system logs next. The maintenance mode activation had always been a critical detail. It showed that someone with access had intentionally paused the recording. During the same window, the pacemaker captured distress. That alignment had supported the original structure of the case. But now, with the possibility of an extended timeline, they looked at the system differently, not just at when it went offline, but at when it came back online. According to system data, recording resumed without any alerts being triggered, cleanly, quietly. That detail had not stood out before because it appeared normal within the context of the original timeline. But when placed against the new evidence, it raised a question: who reactivated the system, and when exactly did that happen? Because if the system was restored after the previously defined window, then someone remained in control of that environment beyond the moment investigators initially focused on. That possibility changed the sequence again. From there, digital analysts began reconstructing device movement with greater precision, not just which devices were present, but how long they stayed, when they disconnected, and when they reappeared elsewhere. According to investigators, one device associated with Tommaso showed a pattern that had not been fully emphasized earlier. It did not leave the area immediately after the pacemaker signal ended. Instead, it remained within range for a period of time that extended beyond the original window. The exact duration has not been publicly confirmed. But investigators have described it as significant enough to reconsider earlier assumptions about departure timing. That detail alone introduced a new layer to the case, because it suggested that whatever occurred inside the house did not conclude at the moment the pacemaker stopped transmitting. It continued. And if it continued, then actions were taken during that extended period that were not originally accounted for. That's when investigators returned to the item recovered from Tommaso's room. This time, not just to examine it in isolation, but to place it within the expanded sequence. According to sources familiar with the analysis, the data associated with that item indicated interaction at a time that did not match the previously accepted timeline. Not drastically different, but outside the original window. Enough to matter. Enough to shift placement. The exact function of the device has not been confirmed publicly, but investigators have indicated that it records user interaction, not continuously, but in specific moments. Moments that can be time-stamped and compared against other data points. And when those timestamps were aligned with the broader timeline, they did not fall where expected. They fell later. That's when the case began to narrow, because if Tommaso's device showed activity after the pacemaker signal ended and his phone remained within the area during that extended period, then his presence inside the timeline was longer than initially believed, and that changes interpretation, not of one event, but of everything connected to it. Investigators then reviewed statements again, not to challenge them immediately, but to compare them against the updated structure. Tommaso had described the night in limited terms: an argument, a moment of tension, a situation that escalated unexpectedly. He had placed himself inside the house, but only within a certain frame. A frame that, until now, aligned closely enough with the data to remain plausible. But with the timeline shifting, that alignment began to weaken. Because if his presence extended beyond the moment he described, then parts of the sequence were missing. And missing parts create gaps. Gaps that investigators now had to fill. That's where the case moved into a more focused phase. Not broad analysis, but targeted reconstruction. Investigators began mapping the extended timeline minute by minute, overlaying pacemaker data, system logs, device interactions, and movement records into a single sequence, looking for continuity, looking for breaks, looking for points where actions could have occurred without being previously accounted for. And what they began to see was not chaos. It was structure. A longer sequence than originally believed, but still controlled, still consistent with intentional behavior rather than random reaction. That distinction matters because extended time creates opportunity. Opportunity to move objects, opportunity to access systems, opportunity to communicate, and communication became the next focus. Investigators re-examined message data connected to the case, not just the content, but the timing. One message in particular had already drawn attention early in the investigation, a short message sent from Tommaso's phone after the pacemaker signal ended. One word: handled. At the time, it had been placed near the end of the original timeline, interpreted as a response following the event. But now, with the extended sequence, its position changed. It no longer sat at the conclusion. It sat within the middle of a longer process. And that changes meaning, because a message sent at the end of an event suggests completion. A message sent during an event suggests coordination. That distinction became central. Investigators traced the recipient again, a prepaid device, limited identification, but movement data showed it had been active within the same general area before leaving along a separate path. That indicated more than one person involved, not just in presence, but in sequence. And when investigators aligned that movement with the extended timeline, something became clear. The second individual did not arrive after the event. They were already part of it. That realization shifted the case further, because now the timeline was not just extended, it was shared. Multiple actions, multiple roles, a sequence that required coordination rather than reaction. And all of it now had to be understood within this new structure. Investigators have not released a full reconstruction publicly, but internally, the direction has become more defined. The original timeline was not incorrect. It was incomplete, and the evidence from Tommaso's room did not introduce a new event. It revealed a missing portion of the sequence, a portion that changes how every other piece is interpreted, because now the focus is no longer just on what happened during those recorded minutes. It is on what happened immediately after. Who remained? Who acted? And why the timeline was left in a form that suggested it ended when it didn't. That question is still being examined, but investigators now understand something they did not before. The event inside that house did not stop when the data went quiet. It continued, and the person who could explain that continuation has not yet fully done so. Investigators did not move quickly after that realization. They moved carefully, because once a timeline is extended, every conclusion that depended on the original structure has to be tested again, not discarded, but verified within the new sequence. And that process takes time. They return first to the physical space, not the entire house, but specific areas that now carried more weight under the updated timeline. Entry points, interior pathways, locations where movement could have occurred without immediately disrupting the visible environment. According to investigators, what they were looking for was not obvious damage. It was subtle change. Objects that had been handled more than once. Positions that suggested adjustment rather than disturbance. Indicators that time had passed inside that space without being previously accounted for. And this is where something else began to stand out. The house, as it had been described early in the investigation, showed signs of control, not chaos, not the kind of disorder typically associated with a sudden event. That observation had always been part of the case, but now it was being interpreted differently, because control requires time. If the event had ended within the original window, the level of control observed afterward would have been difficult to explain, but with an extended timeline, it became more consistent. It suggested that whoever remained inside the house after the initial event had the opportunity to stabilize the environment, to adjust, to remove or reposition anything that did not fit the appearance of normal. That possibility shifted attention to sequence again. What happened first? What happened next? And what happened after everything appeared to have stopped? Investigators began reconstructing movement inside the house in a different way. Not just by where activity occurred, but by when it could have occurred relative to the extended timeline. They examined pathways between rooms, distances, the time required to move from one area to another, the order in which systems would have been accessed. Because sequence is not just about time, it is about feasibility. And what they found was that the extended window created enough time for multiple actions to take place without overlap. Actions that would have required focus, actions that would have required awareness of the environment. That detail became important because awareness suggests intent. At the same time, investigators continued working through digital reconstruction, not just phones and primary devices, but secondary systems, devices that operate in the background, devices that record interaction in smaller ways. According to sources familiar with the case, one of those systems produced a detail that had not been emphasized earlier. A short interaction, brief, less than a minute, but time-stamped, and placed clearly within the extended portion of the timeline. The exact device has not been publicly identified, but investigators have confirmed that it was located within the house and that it required physical proximity to activate. That detail matters because it places someone inside the environment at a specific moment after the pacemaker signal had already ended, which confirms presence, not assumed presence, confirmed presence. That finding was not treated as isolated. It was immediately compared against everything else: device movement, message timing, system access, and when aligned, it reinforced the same conclusion. The house was not empty after the initial event. Someone remained. Investigators then returned to communication patterns again, the message that had already drawn attention. The single word sent from Tommaso's phone was now being evaluated alongside additional data points, not just when it was sent, but what followed, because communication does not exist in isolation. It exists within a sequence. After that message was sent, there was a gap, not in signal, but in outward communication. No additional messages, no calls that have been publicly confirmed, but internal device activity continued. That distinction became significant because it suggested that communication had served a purpose, a checkpoint, a confirmation that something had been completed or reached a certain stage, but not the end. Investigators began asking a more focused question. If that message marked a midpoint rather than a conclusion, then what actions followed it? That is where the case begins to narrow further. Because everything after that message now falls within the extended timeline. Everything after becomes part of the same structured sequence: movement out of the house, transport, the first stop location that had already been identified through earlier analysis, and beyond that, the second movement path that had not yet been fully explained. Each of those steps now had to be understood as part of a continuous process rather than separate events. And that changes interpretation because continuity requires coordination. Coordination requires more than one role. Investigators have not publicly confirmed the full scope of involvement, but based on the structure being analyzed, the working assumption has shifted, not from one individual to multiple possibilities, but from one sequence to a coordinated sequence involving more than one participant. That shift carries weight because it affects how responsibility is assigned, it affects how actions are interpreted, and it affects how the case will ultimately be presented. At this stage, investigators are no longer building a broad narrative. They are refining a specific one, testing each element against the others, looking for consistency. And what they are finding is that the extended timeline does not create disorder. It creates clarity, because gaps that once existed are now being filled. Not completely, but enough to change the direction of the case. The room that was once considered peripheral has now become central, because the evidence found there did not introduce something new. It revealed something missing. A portion of time that had not been accounted for. And within that time, actions took place. Actions that connect directly to the rest of the sequence. The exact details of those actions have not been released publicly, but investigators have indicated that the reconstruction is nearing a point where the sequence can be presented as a complete structure, not partial, not assumed, but supported. And when that happens, the focus will shift one final time, from reconstruction to accountability. Because once the timeline is fully established, the remaining question is not what happened, it is who was responsible for each part of it. And based on everything now being analyzed, that answer may involve more than one person, which brings the investigation to its current position, not at a conclusion, but at the point where the missing time is no longer missing. And once time is accounted for, the next step becomes unavoidable: explaining it.